Welcome back to Analysis. We've been talking about the presidential elections in Chile. The first round brought victory for the centre-left candidate, Michelle Bachelet. But she has her critics. They say she's uncritical of foreign investors, particularly from America, a country which is not thought of fondly by many Chileans. She's also previously come under criticism for the treatment of the indigenous Mapuche Indians during her previous administration, where their demands for the return of ancestral land fell on deaf ears. Mapuche separatists have been involved in violent confrontations with the security forces. Like many countries in Latin America, Chile's relationship with its indigenous population continues to be tense. Well, my guests from the first part of the programme have rejoined me, and we're also happy to welcome Kristina Bachelet, who's a Chilean political analyst. Welcome to the programme. Kristina, well, let's start with you, because you're a fresh pair of eyes on this. Do you think that let's say in regards to the indigenous population, is the record of a second term going to be better than the first term?
It is not a good record, as you said before, but I have to say that it's not such an important issue at this election, at least in terms of the public opinion in general. There are some people who are trying to forget how was the first Bachelet ruling. And now the promises are talking about a completely different story. So I think with the indigenous issue is pretty much the same thing. We're trying to forget what was the first term of Bachelet 4 years ago, and we're heading to a kind of different story, more to the left, as you said before. And it is implicit that if it's more to the left, it's going to be more congenial, or at least less harsh with those indigenous outspoken demands.
Is it a litmus test issue, even if it's not kind of something that seizes the mass of the population? Is it something that you can tell the character of the government from its attitude here?
To the indigenous population? Oh yes, I think it's part of the worldwide tendency for more and more groups to demand identity rights and their human rights. And that would include, of course, the gay movements, gay rights movements, and other types as well. But of course, it's also a Latin American phenomenon that maybe the Mapuches feel that they haven't yet gained the rights that others have in Peru and Ecuador.
Yeah, but I think it's a very big issue, and I think it's been a very big issue in Latin America. It's a major issue in Ecuador. It's a major issue in Bolivia. I mean, of course, those are countries that have a very big indigenous population.
Yeah, in the case of Chile, it's more like in just one part of the
Yes,
of the
but
country.
still, it is definitely a major issue, and I think it will become a bigger issue in Chile now if Bachelet
Do you think it's
is
being
elected,
dragged forward
because
by what's happened
there's
in
also
Bolivia?
a kind of working relationship established between the student movement and the indigenous movement, and I think that therefore will have also a strong bearing, hopefully.
Dr. Manning's still with us. What do you think about this? Do you think that perhaps the prominence that the indigenous peoples have had, say, in Bolivia will have an impact on this issue in Chile?
Well, I think that each country has their own indigenous groups, and in some cases in Bolivia they're very diverse. We tend to think of as outsiders, the indigenous movement in Bolivia as something monolithic or unified, and it isn't. And there are struggles there and differences in all the countries. There are some countries like Guatemala and Bolivia that have much more pronounced and larger indigenous populations, 60% in some cases, and that's not the case in Chile. So what I think will be important for any minority rights or oriented groups to move their agenda forward is to find allies in other sectors. And so the alliance, temporary or not, that can be constructed between indigenous groups, students, basically any organization or movement that is trying to bring change, and that they can ally and find support for each other on their different positions. One area of confluence is environmental issues. There were protests that moved from the student demonstrations into the protests against the hydroelectric dam that the Piñera government has promoted in the south, which will have severe environmental consequences. And so that is a way to mesh progressive concerns that should be nationwide with indigenous and land rights and protection of natural resources.
Okay, well, let's move on to consider this in the kind of more general context of politics in Latin America. Cristobal, you know, there's this phrase, the pink tide. I mean, it's if you ask me, it's a bit of an ugly phrase for the sort of left governments in Latin America. But lumping them together is a bit unhelpful, isn't it? In this sense, that as we were saying in the first part, there's a very radical process took place in Venezuela. That the electoral victories of Chavez were embedded in a much wider, more radical social process. Whereas in Chile, perhaps we're looking at something which is, well, more like a kind of European left social democratic process. So, is it very helpful to put them together in this way?
I think there are good reasons to think about two different processes. At least the Venezuelan case is a more authoritarian regime, at least less tolerant with dissenters, any kind of dissenters. I think we have enough of that authoritarianism in Chile in the last year, so it's very difficult for us to turn in that direction, like this kind of leftist authoritarian government, very militarist government like the Venezuelan model. I think that the institutionality of the institutional economic forces in Chile are stronger than in Venezuela, and I think the political right wing in Chile is better organized than Venezuela's political right. So I think there's a lot of different characteristics that we allow me to say that there are two different processes.
I have to disagree.
And Daniel, just me briefly on
I perhaps would like to put in a plug for those who are not in a movement, because we talked about the huge inequality gap, economic inequality. One of the big indicators where Chile lags, and so it's not as bad as Venezuela and Brazil, but it's a very Latin American phenomenon, and that is the number of young women who have children before they're 21 or 25. And this is a very strong indicator used by the UN to measure world progress in all countries. And there are far too many young women who see no prospects, or who are subject to violence or rape and get pregnant because they have no sense of themselves going to higher education and getting a job and becoming autonomous. So I think those silent voices are one constituency which the President could well address, given her commitment to general social issues.
Well,
do you think that, you know, Cristobal's point, isn't the polarisation in Venezuelan politics because the Chavez government actually took on the vested interests in a way that the Bachelet government just didn't attempt to? So, of course, there's going to be a greater kind of, you know, friction between the different sides in politics.
Absolutely. And also, I wouldn't call the Chavez government authoritarian. I mean, I think that's absurd. I think Venezuela was a lot more democratic, and Chavez won more elections than any of the other governments put together, frankly. And if you look at the way the students were treated in Chile, for example, the kind of huge repression that there has been in relation to the students, the Mapuches, any kind of social movement in Chile, the idea that somehow you have a benign democracy is absolutely ridiculous. That's really not what the situation is. I think Venezuela tried to do a lot more. I think Venezuela also stood up to the United States. You have to remember that Venezuela and Cuba were the only two countries that did not take part in the UN occupation of Haiti. Everybody else went in, call them pink, blue, whatever you like, they all went in, and Uruguay has just withdrawn from that occupation right now. Why? Because it was US policy, so they were happy to be there, and also they made money out of it, so who cares about the Haitians? And that tells you how opportunistic these governments have also been. And Chile was there, even Argentina was there. Venezuela was not. Venezuela has been a lot more principled than the other governments. And yes, the right wing in Venezuela is absolutely rabid against Chavismo, and they still are. And they have the backing of the US in doing that.
Okay. Dr. Manning, do you think that one of the sort of international factors that has given governments in Latin America, wherever they are on the kind of pink-red spectrum, the ability to carry on over the last decade has been the fact that American power has been very much focused on the wars in the Middle East, and it's kind of neutralized them as a force in the way that they were in previous decades in terms of direct interference in Latin America.
Well, clearly the U.S. is busy in conflicts in the Middle East and Central Asia. However, this is not just, I think, a vacuum in which I don't think of Latin America as a space in which the U.S. operates and now there's a vacuum of that power. There are many ways that Latin America in the last 10 years has come of age, and I think they're not there by any means in terms of mature polities that are responsive to the people, as we see when we have protests on the streets, and whether it's Chile
say Britain
or
hasn't got there either.
Oh well, or the United States, where I'm based right now. What I think is important is that Latin American countries have taken ownership of foreign policy and leadership in international organizations in a very constructive way. And Chile is really at the forefront of that. There is a space in international organizations where Chile can do some of the things that it is often hard for them to do in their own home turf due to the constraints of the Constitution. And the earlier conversation about distinguishing Chile and Venezuela, and Venezuela has gone far and Chile hasn't. Well, Venezuela wrote a new constitution, so they were able to do that. They created new rules. The Chavez government did. In Chile, that's not possible. You would need substantial majorities to do that. But getting back to the international dimensions, the creation of UNASUR, the role that Chile has championed in supporting human security over other kinds of sort of hard security, and thinking about that security is something that must apply for every civilian in the country. It's not something of the state. It's a human dimension in which women and children are usually the greatest victims in conflicts. And so I think that there are important ways that Latin America has taken initiative and responsibility for its own relations. And the fact that the U.S. is not a member of UNASUR and never will be, it won't be included, it creates a separate forum in which they can decide things and take initiatives like Haiti. And I would say Haiti is not an occupation situation. It's a peacekeeping operation. And the number one players in that organization are countries that have historically grown in their importance in taking ownership of the peace side of conflicts, such as Argentina or Uruguay. And of course, it's not without problem. But these are important ways in which the militaries in the region have been reprogrammed to do new tasks that are actually constructive.
Okay. Cristobal, I mean, it's noticeable that at least some governments in Latin America have systematically, over the whole period of the so-called war on terror, taken positions which are very critical of the United States. Yeah. Of course, Chile has a sizable Palestinian population. Yeah. How do you read the sort of international stance now, and how do you read it perhaps under the second?
Well, sadly, I have to say that international affairs are neither part of the most striking political agenda these days. I mean, there are other issues more important. In these days, the more important issues are the new constitution, for example. We won't have, or we will have a new constitution, education, and I will say a tax reform. But the other sensible issues like the indigenous, how to deal with the indigenous historical discrimination. I mean, the most that we can get in the next 4 years, even with a very progressive Bachelet, is like, I don't know, constitutional recognition. But I think no more than that, nor political autonomy, that's not going to happen. In terms of international affairs, they are not in top of mind of the Chilean voter. Perhaps the only subject or issue which is important is that we have a trial against Peru, which is in The Hague these days. So it's a matter of bilateral issues more than a wide image of international affairs. But it's true, we have a very strong Palestinian community, we have a Jewish community as well, and I think that's not, I mean, an issue like very hot in Chile, at least these days, pre-electoral days.
Dr. Threlfall, do you think that the kind of the stances that have been taken then are kind of stances which can be taken because they're not central? I mean, you know, then there's no real question of Latin American countries being closely involved in any of the sort of actual military operations in the Middle East. So, I mean, perhaps Cristobal's suggesting, or perhaps one consequence that could be drawn from what he's saying is that the stances can be taken without domestic political cost, I suppose, is one way of putting it.
Yes, I agree. I don't see that international issues have really been very prominent in the campaign, and I think that her record will stand or fall on domestic issues, probably, given the issue of education, as we keep saying, which is, you know, not easy because of financial implications, but also the electoral law. I mean, basics of democracy. It's not just the constitution, but it's the element that has to be passed by a constitutional type majority, at least 2/3, is the electoral law, which is a very peculiar one, invented by a far right winger, who was right wing even in his student days. I remember him from the 70s.
And it's a very weird model. I think it's Poland and Chile.
Unique. It's invented in Chile. Unique and doesn't exist anywhere else. Should get rid of it. They should also
just for viewers who might not
make
be
it
familiar
easier
with
for women to get into power.
What's wrong with it and what needs to go?
Oh, how long do we have?
Not very long.
No, they should
So
move
to
a
a
more
version.
electoral systems. Of course, some countries have anomalies, but it's not usually a good idea. I mean, they've been tried and tested, and they've got to move to proportional representation with a moderate proportionality, not extreme proportionality like Britain. They should not do majoritarian types, which that gives too much of a majority to the leading government, to the winning government. And they should introduce systems to allow women to come forward in the candidatures. I mean, they have a quota system. Parties are supposed to field women, but it's not working. It's not being implemented properly, and that's because the parties haven't taken it on board. They don't own it. You know, she already has the older person's vote strongly, and then she has to address the younger person's vote, and that way she will have a successful presidency. And the relationship between the social movements and the way she deals with them, I think, is important, although it's not the only thing, because student leaders, social movement leaders, create a new agenda, but then they move on to a party, because without being in a party, you can't actually fill candidates, you can't win power, you can't do anything. You can't even win a local government and institute a minor little mini project. You have to get into politics, you have to get into parties.
Okay, so Nina, so at the end of a second term, is it going to be the fact that the constitutional questions get addressed, that the educational crisis is solved, that the student leaders have an effect on pushing the government to the left, or is it going to be that participation rates will be even lower because people say even under a second term we had better hopes of it, didn't happen?
Well, you know, nobody knows. I mean, nobody knows. It could go either way. I think it depends also what happens in other countries. Although you're saying that the international questions are not necessarily a big issue during the election, that's often true in elections.
Yeah. I'm talking
It's
about in
often
terms
true
of the
that
media,
domestic,
public
you know,
opinion.
economics, etc. At the time of the election, that's often the issue. Although sometimes it's not. We know with Tony Blair and the Iraq War, but it doesn't mean that the whole of Latin America, and in fact whatever happens in the world, will not have a huge impact on whatever happens in Chile and what the Chilean movement is able to do and is able to push the government to do. Because in the end, you know, what governments do has to do with how strong the movement is outside to push them to do it. I want to mention one thing that should not be forgotten, and that is Honduras. Because Honduras has had a coup. It's not true that the US no longer has an impact in Latin America and Central America. I wish it were true, but they still do, and they were involved in the coup in Honduras. And they've just had elections in Honduras. Zelaya was taken out. His wife then stood for election, and she's saying there was electoral fraud on a mass scale, and I believe that that is very likely to be the case. So there was Honduras. There was also Paraguay, where Lagos was taken out. So there's, you know, the U.S. is still very much involved and very much wanting to be involved, and it's part of the movement to get the U.S. out of there.
Okay, we're moving towards the end of the programme. So Dr. Manny, at the end of a second term, is this government going to be up the redder end of the pink spectrum or down the paler end of the pink spectrum?
I hope it's a little darker pink at least than in the first term. But I think an important aspect to keep in mind is that we need to have a longer shadow of the future for Chile. Nothing is going to be resolved definitively in the next 4 years, just as it hasn't in the last 4 years. And perhaps the last 4 years were really treading the water, not any major initiative. So in some ways, Bachelet has to come from behind to catch up. What I think is important is some of the broad trends we're seeing in Latin America, that is a growing middle class and the erosion of extreme poverty, which puts people into a segment just above poverty where they are still very vulnerable. And that is the segment that can get lost. And that is the pivotal segment, the segment between the very poor and the middle class. And the focus needs to be there. And the focus needs to be through social programs, through redistribution. Many countries of the pink tide that you're describing doing exactly that. Bolsa Familia in Brazil and other programs in Argentina.
Okay, just let me stop you there because we've got about 30 seconds left. So I'm going to ask the other two guests, a deeper shade of red or a paler shade of pink?
I think it's going to be more on the left, but I think we have to be very cautious with our high expectations. High expectation can be very tricky.
Okay, Dr. Threlfall.
It's not really left or right. I think it's a gender issue here. I think that's going to be more prominent, and in that sense, it'll affect greater segments of the population. So in that sense, it will be progressive, whether it's called left or right.
Well, I'd like to thank all my guests for that insightful discussion about the politics of Chile. We'll be reviewing the situation as the government takes shape and as the movements respond to it. So please do rejoin us for future editions of Analysis.